As someone who has experienced traumatic grief, I can tell you that grief theories don't always make sense. Sometimes these grief theorists have not even experienced extreme grief or traumatic grief. And if they have, it is again kind of their journey, their perspective. Many theorists are human behavioralists. They are looking at kind of externally this process of grief. So let's talk about grief theories. And as someone who has experienced traumatic loss, I lost a son in a drowning accident. I have lost a son to after 10 years of medical trauma. My most traumatic grief was waking up to my daughter already being dead. And most recently, I've lost my husband. I'm also a psychiatric nurse practitioner, so I understand kind of medically, psychologically, and personally what grief is and what that process looks like. So let's start with the 5 stages of grief that everyone talks about. And I can tell you that this does not resonate with me at all, that it is not a clean, stage of grief. I can also tell you that scientifically, this grief theory was created observing people in hospice. So what they were going through as they were personally dying. It wasn't until later that it was kind of shifted to the caregiver and what they were experiencing. So let's move on from that. There's other grief theories out there. Dialectical thinking and grief. I kind of like this concept. It's not comprehensive, but it challenges you to look at opposites are true. So dialectical thinking is this concept that 2 opposing thoughts can both be true. For example, I know that my loved ones are in heaven. So maybe you believe that your loved one is in a good place, right? But I also have this excruciating pain and anger at God for taking them. You see how both of those can be true? And so the dialectical thinking and grief, it's a really good way to help organize some of those conflicts that go on in our brain. The next one I want to talk about is growing around grief. This theory talks about, because in that 5 stages, it makes it seem like the pain is less as you go on, that you can let it go, that you will get over it. And those are trigger words for people who have lost someone that they're very close to. Growing around grief gives this picture of like a jar, and the pain of grief is like this ball at the bottom of the jar. And right when you lose that person, the jar is small around that pain. But as you grow around your grief, the jar gets bigger. The pain of the grief doesn't get smaller. I love this theory, and it gives us a visual on how to grow from our pain. 4 tasks of grief. Don't like this one too much. It's, like if you just do these 4 things, the pain will kind of dissipate over time. And there's some truth to it because it does challenge you to kind of confront that grief. Another theory that is kind of task-based is the 6 R's of grieving. And I'm going to look down and actually read them because I do think these are tasks that we could kind of embrace. If I do these things, I can start moving through my grief. Now, I am a traumatic grief expert, and I do a grief intensive that allows people to really get in and separate the grief from the trauma, because yes, you can go through these tasks for your grief, but if you've got trauma enmeshed with that grief, we need to separate that and do something different with the trauma. So if you are interested in attending the grief intensive, click the link below and let's get you started on learning how to separate grief and trauma. But back to grief and those grief theories, the 6 R's of grieving, these are like tasks. Recognize the loss and the impact that it has on your life, right? The second R is react to the separation. Be real and authentic with the feelings and the pain. I often talk about grief as pain, and we need to feel that pain. Recollect and re-experience. Spend time in the positive memories. So if you sit down and begin to re-experience things with your loved one and they are positive, that is grieving. If you begin to have flashbacks and visions of the negative things that are associated with that grief, that's your trauma. Come experience the grief intensive with me so we can help separate that grief from that trauma. Relinquish old attachments. Not quite sure I would say relinquish them. And we'll talk about that with some other grief theories. But you know, the reality that living on this earth with that person is no longer in a physical reality. Readjust to that and then reinvest in yourself and your life without that person. Very hard to do when it's a child, a spouse, a sibling, right? But reinvesting in your current life and your future life is super important in the healing of grief. The dual process model, I think, is the most kind of scientific and comprehensive because it's talking about oscillation. So we go through this period of grief and loss and feeling that pain, and then we are trying to readjust and do all these things to continue our life, right? But it's not a stage. It is oscillation. And so the pain and the future, the pain and the future, the pain and the future, and it oscillates like this for potentially a long time. And I have found that to be true in my grief journey as well. Grief work theory was developed by Freud, which, you know, there's a lot of Freud's theories that I don't attain to, but I think this grief work is really good because it talks about confronting grief. We don't confront grief, we don't acknowledge our pain, and so confronting your grief, feeling those feelings so that you can take that energy, process it, and kind of move it forward into your future. Now we're getting into some of my favorite. Grief and attachment. When you lose a child, when you lose a spouse, that attachment is very strong. And there's actually a physical attachment, a mother and a child, right? So with my biological children, and no discredit or disrespect to my adopted son that died, there is an additional attachment in a biological mother-child relationship because I held them in my womb for 9 months. I breastfed them, which creates oxytocin. Oxytocin creates an attachment. And that attachment, that bond, was perceivably severed. And I say perceivably because when I go into the next theory, there's hope in that, right? But the way in which you are attached to the person that you lost and the way in which your attachment style does dictate some of how you go through this grieving process. So the attachment theory was very beneficial for me. And I think this is true when you lose your mother, right? Because there is also that physical attachment. My most favorite is the continuing bonds. And this talks about, like, just because that person, that soul, is not here on earth, that our souls are eternal. And this is not a religious theory. This is a spiritual theory of, you know, our souls are continuous. There is something after our time here on earth. And those bonds, those relationships that we have are continuous. And that has been true in my life as well. When I lost my son Reggie in 2016, I had a little bit of an experience with him. But after losing my third child, I needed to connect. And I have been thankful to be able to connect with my children as they are in the next life. And so I always challenge the spiritual conflict, especially in grief, right? Grief of losing a loved one to death really makes you wrestle with what happens after death. Trajectories of grief, it kind of talks about different styles or if somebody is resilient, what they would, how they might manifest their grief. I would really caution you if somebody is being very outwardly resilient, are they really internally confronting their grief and working through the pain, especially if it's traumatic grief? Are we getting in there and separating that trauma? Talks about delayed grief and just how we approach grief could indicate the long-term impact of grief. There's lots of new research on the grieving brain. We've done tons of research on what trauma does to the brain, and we know that trauma creates new neural pathways, likely negative neural pathways, and creates problems both mentally and physically. There's new research showing the impact and the changes that happen in the grieving brain as well. And lastly, the physical impact of grief, which I have a whole video on that. So let's go into our questions. This is from a viewer. I understand the 5 stages of grief as being cyclical and that you kind of bounce back and forth between depression, bargaining, till you finally get to acceptance. And I found that true in some of my grieving process. I don't think that the 5 stages of grief is to be completely thrown out. But when we look at traumatic grief and what I have experienced of multiple losses and multiple factors that are integrated into my grief, trauma being one of them, spiritual conflict being a huge one, the 5 stages did not at all resonate with me. So I'm not saying that the 5 stages, there's no room for it. I'm saying when you do not feel like your grief is fitting into those 5 stages, there's nothing wrong with you. It's just, let's look at some of these other theories. Let's look at trauma and grief, and let's see if we can't separate that grief so that we can feel that pain. I think the other thing that is a trigger word for me in the 5 stages of grief is the word acceptance. That somehow, someday, I'm just going to accept that this is good for me, that this was part of God's plan, or this was the plan for my life. And although I intellectually know that, my heart hurts saying that, right? And so, and it's been 3 years since my daughter's death, I think 7 or 8 years since my son's death. So acceptance is a trigger word when you have experienced traumatic grief. And so maybe it's just the wording and not necessarily the stages. And again, if you haven't separated the trauma, it's not just going to be all, time heals all wounds. It's not just going to go away and you naturally go through those stages without working through something. This is from a counselor. Says, none of these grief theories address prolonged grief disorder, and how does that fit in? This is super important, right? Prolonged grief disorder is a DSM diagnosis, right? And so the DSM criteria is really just this book that we use professionally to diagnose so that we can kind of incorporate treatment, right? So if somebody came to us in grief and had no other diagnosis, we might give them adjustment disorder. And then after a year, we might change that to prolonged grief disorder to justify why we are still working through their grief without another diagnosis, right? Unfortunately, the way our medical system works is we have to have a diagnosis in order to give people treatment. I do not think grieving after 1 year is abnormal. I think in having experienced the loss of children is at least 5 years of significant struggle before there's kind of a decrease in the intensity and frequency in which you have to grieve. But 10, 20 years from now, I guarantee you I will cry on my children's birthdays. I guarantee you that holidays will continue to be reminders of what I have lost. That doesn't mean I have some sort of disorder, okay? So it's kind of a system issue, and so let's just keep it in that box per se. Last question is, what is your favorite or scientifically solid grief theory? So I shared that my favorite is the continuing bonds because it is what healed my spiritual conflict. I think the dual process with the oscillating makes a lot of scientific sense rather than stages. I really don't like any of them that give you stages, but the oscillating seems to be most scientifically comprehensive. That's called the dual process. But my heart loves the continuing bonds. Don't forget that grief can have physical symptoms. Watch the physical symptoms. I go deep into what grief does to the body.